When a person gives himself airs because he can understand and interpret the books of Chrysippus, say to yourself, if Chrysippus had not written obscurely, this man would have nothing about which to give himself airs. But what is it I want? To learn nature and to follow her. I seek, therefore, someone to interpret her. And having heard that Chrysippus does so, I go to him. But I do not understand what he has written. I seek, therefore, the person who interprets Chrysippus. And down to this point, there is nothing to justify pride. But when I find the interpreter, what remains is to put his precepts into practice. This is the only thing to be proud about. If, however, I admire the mere act of interpretation, what have I done but turned into a grammarian instead of a philosopher? The only difference, indeed, is that I interpret Chrysippus instead of Homer. Far from being proud, therefore, when someone says to me, "Read me Chrysippus," I blush the rather when I am unable to show him such deeds as match and harmonize with his words.
Epictetus was a teacher of Stoic philosophy, and so he moved in circles in which people did talk a lot about Stoic philosophy. And he also probably had a lot of students who came to him who had done some previous reading. So you notice that he talks here about Chrysippus. Chrysippus was sometimes called the second founder of the Stoic school, in part because he wrote so much, and he also wrote a lot in response to critics of the Stoic school, sometimes attacking them, sometimes defending the Stoic principles. And so to read Chrysippus was, in many respects for ancient people, to study Stoicism. And so Epictetus wants to counsel us against what we can call the difference not between book smarts and street smarts, the way people like to talk, but between sort of an academic, theoretical treatment of Stoicism and then actually making it part of your life, actually practicing it. So he says, when a person gives himself airs because he can understand and interpret the books of Chrysippus, say to yourself, well, that's because Chrysippus wrote obscurely, and so it's difficult to understand him. Similarly, we have a kind of distance with respect to Epictetus. He wrote in Koine Greek, and it's translated often by these kind of Oxfordy, types, and so it may be a little bit difficult. I shouldn't myself, for example, put on airs in providing you this commentary because all I'm doing is sort of bridging a gap, right? If it was super easy to read Epictetus and to understand everything that he was saying, no need for commentary, right? So he goes on and he says, what is it that I want? I want to learn nature and to follow her, so I seek, therefore, someone to interpret nature, and having heard Chrysippus does so, I go to him. This is why we read philosophers. This is why we study with philosophy teachers, because we think, well, they've got something that I want. It's not necessarily the end product. It's something that will get me there. And so I go and I read Chrysippus, because I've heard this Chrysippus guy knows a lot of stuff. He can explain things really well. He's going to help me out, right? And so I read him, and then I say, I don't understand what's going on here. I can't understand what has been written. So then I go and find, as he says, somebody who can interpret Chrysippus. And then he says, down to this point, there is nothing to justify pride. There is nothing to justify making a big deal out of oneself. And then he says, when I find the interpreter, what remains is to put his precepts into practice. This is the only thing to be proud about. If you want to be proud about the fact, not that you studied the philosophy, not that you've got a diploma in it, not that you have, whatever marks or distinctions you want. Be proud about the fact that you can actually apply it in a real way. Not just in a theoretical way. Not just in a, maybe down the line I'll do this sort of way. But in a real way. So he goes on and he says, if, however, I admire the mere act of interpretation, what have I done? I've turned into a mere grammarian, a person who studies not just grammar, but literature. That's what grammarian meant back then. A person who studied it and taught it, perhaps, rather than being a philosopher. So he says, the only difference is that I interpret Chrysippus instead of Homer. Far from being proud, therefore, when someone says to me, read me Chrysippus, I blush when I'm unable to show him such deeds as match and harmonize with his words. That is really an interesting thing to say at the end. We talk a lot about, different figures or different authors or even, filmmakers or things like that, about how cool they are, about, what characters they develop and show us. The real test for all this is whether we can incorporate that into our own lives. Otherwise, it's just sort of an academic exercise. And if you want to do academic exercises, that's fine. Stoicism is about more than that.
Whatever principles are set before you, stand fast by these like laws, feeling that it would be impiety for you to transgress them. But pay no attention to what somebody says about you, for this is, at length, not under your control.
In this very short chapter, number 50, Epictetus tells us two things that are not really connected with each other, one of which is very rich in implications, and the other of which is a repetition of things that we've heard a number of times. So I'm going to start with the second. He says, pay no attention to what somebody says about you, for this is at length not under your control. And this is a reminder that we don't have to be concerned with how other people view us, because that is something that we don't control. It's largely a product of their own filters and their own, aims and desires, and how their desires and aversions flow out into the world. We should think of other people as essentially being in the same condition as ourselves, except not having had the message that Stoicism is able to provide them with, and is usually thinking that they're doing all right, that they've got things figured out, even though they're usually quite a mess, right? So we don't have to worry about what they think about us. Now, the thing that's more rich in implications, like I said here, is this very short passage, which is, whatever principles are set before you, stand fast by these like laws. The Greek term is nomos, feeling that it would be impiety for you to transgress them, that it would be not only wrong in a moral sense, but that there would be something like, the bottom dropping out of the universe. So, when somebody goes against what they consider to be holy, that which provides meaning running throughout the entire existence of the person. When you go against that, that's more than just going against, say, social opinion, or even against, what you know to be right or wrong, unless you've got a very, very highly developed sense of right or wrong. And now notice that he talks in terms of laws. Now, why is that important? In part because we should look at these principles that are given to us, the ways that we ought to behave that have been discussed throughout the rest of this work, as being something like rules that we don't get to play loose with. We don't get to interpret and say, well, it doesn't apply to me in this case, because this is a special exception. And so what would be an example of that? If it's bad for you to lose your temper at somebody at all, as is what the Stoics think, then you don't get to say, oh yeah, but they said something mean to me, or they let me down, or they cut me off in traffic. It's bad for you, and you shouldn't do it. And so, what does the rest of the law say? Okay, acknowledge that you screwed up, and then don't just say, oh, I'm going to acknowledge it and then move on. Do what you need to do to fix things. Fix things with the other person, if that's what needs to happen. And also fix things within yourself so that you can quit making that same mistake. If you allow yourself to be upset because some person who promised you a job doesn't come through with the job, these are things that happen all the time, realize that this is one of these cases where you need to apply the distinction between what's in your power, what's not in your power. Don't say, well, on this occasion, I get to go out and commiserate with my friends and complain about how unfair the process is because it really was more unfair this time. If you're going to treat Stoicism as something that you can kind of pick and choose, it's not going to be as successful for you. Now, Epictetus doesn't say that, you can't try that. Go ahead and try it out. See how that works and see if you actually make any progress. Epictetus is saying if you do want to make progress, you need to treat the principles that you've got to work with as if they are laws that apply all the way across the board and then follow them.
How long will you still wait to think yourself worthy of the best things and in nothing to transgress against the distinctions set up by the reason? You have received the philosophical principles which you ought to accept, and you have accepted them. What sort of teacher, then, do you still wait for, that you should put off reforming yourself until he arrives? You are no longer a lad, but already a full-grown man. If you are now neglectful and easygoing and always making one delay after another and fixing first one day, then another, after which you will pay attention to yourself, then without realizing it you will make no progress, but living and dying will continue to be a layman throughout. Make up your mind, therefore, before it is too late, that the fitting thing for you to do is to live as a mature man who is making progress, and let everything which seems to you to be best be for you a law that must not be transgressed. And if you meet anything that is laborious or sweet or held in high repute or in no repute, remember that now is the contest, and here before you are the Olympic Games, and that it is impossible to delay any longer, and that it depends on a single day and a single action, whether progress is lost or saved. This is the way Socrates became what he was, by paying attention to nothing but his reason in everything that he encountered. And even if you are not yet a Socrates, still you ought to live as one who wishes to be a Socrates.
Even though it was written over 2 millennia ago, this advice that we're getting in chapter 51 is always timely. And why is that the case? Well, whenever we read it, it always does apply to us. And it's about time and about, the progress of our lives and about the fact that we've already wasted enough time frittering it away, not doing what we ought to do, and now is the time to decide. Or we can put it off some more and maybe see what happens. That's our choice. We do have a free faculty of choice. But Epictetus says here that, no, it is time to make a decision. And notice towards the end how he frames this. He talks about the Olympic Games. And this is sort of like the pinnacle of athletic success. So this is talking to each of us as if we are going into the Olympic Games. And we are. The Olympic Games of life. Whether we become the kinds of people that we were originally intended to be, or whether we continue on with the kinds of people that we've wound up being and we've made ourselves, that is the most important thing in the world to Epictetus. So he says, remember, now is the contest. Here before you are the Olympic Games. It is impossible to delay any longer. It depends on a single day and a single action whether progress is lost or saved. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But I wanted to stress this metaphor of the Olympic Games because it shows us that he considers this to be the most important thing. Your business success, your love life, your circle of friends, how your body looks, those are minor compared to whether you get yourself straight about who you are, what kind of thing you are, and what you have the potential to be, and then do it. It doesn't do any good to know all this and then not actually practice it, any more than it would for an Olympic athlete to go and, stand there with all the other swimmers, and then the gun goes off and they just stand there thinking about, I really like swimming. Swimming is so cool. You got to jump in the water and move, right? So let's start where he starts. how long will you still wait to think yourself worthy of the best things? That's a really interesting question. We have a lot of self-help people who push, and also in other areas as well. They push this, you have to think of yourself as worthy of goodness, and then the universe will give it to you. They often have a mistaken conception of what goodness is and about being worthy is. Epictetus thinks that we're worthy of living in accordance with nature, having our faculty of choice in accordance with nature, making ourselves into the kinds of people that we have the potential to be without conflicts within ourselves, dealing all right with the conflicts that arise in the outside world, happy, unfettered, free. That is a possibility for us. That is better than anything else that we could be provided with. That's better than winning the lottery. That's better than the person that you find who you're totally attracted to. That's better than statues being erected to you. That's better than being invited to give a set of prestigious lectures. That's better than all of these sorts of things, according to Epictetus. Not that those aren't, nice things, but they'll certainly be put in fuller perspective if you're actually happy in your life. So he says, how long are you going to wait? How long are you going to wait to not transgress against distinctions set up by reason? This is another key theme in this passage. What is going to guide you towards that? It's your faculty of reason, of rationality. What is distinctively human in you? What you have and what you need to develop. It's not as if your faculty of reason is perfect. It's not like, plug-in software or hardware that you just pop into your motherboard. You need to work on it. You need to develop it. That's why education is so vitally important. So he goes on and he says, look, you've received the philosophical principles which you ought to accept. You've been studying Stoicism. You've got it in your hand. Now, you've accepted them, at least in a certain sense. You have taken them in. What sort of teacher then do you wait for? Who are you waiting to solve your problems? Who are you waiting to give you the advice about how to proceed? Why are you waiting around for somebody else to give you the guidance? You have the resources you need. So he goes on and he says, what sort of teacher do you wait for that you should put off reforming yourself until he arrives? Now, that's not to say it's not helpful to have a teacher or interpreter. My hope in producing these videos is that my years of studying Epictetus help you as you study Epictetus and try to apply this in your life. Not to say that any of that doesn't help, right? But this is the great thing about Stoicism. You can do it whether you're on a desert island by yourself or in the middle of a metropolis as a lonely person who doesn't know anybody, who just got plunked down there because, your flight got canceled or something like that, right? You don't have to wait for somebody else to come along and solve your problems for you. You've been given what you need. So he says, all right, you're no longer a child, but already a full-grown person. And at the time that I think most of us read this, there may be some people who are, in fact, adolescents who are watching this, and maybe his advice doesn't fully apply to you. We know, for example, that impulse control is something that continues to develop as we get older, up till 25 now. We've realized, although science may tell us something different in years down the line. And so, this may not apply to everybody, although certainly one can begin to practice Stoic philosophy as a young person. But for those of us who are no longer children and adolescents, what's our excuse? Why aren't we putting it into practice? What is it that we're waiting for? He says, if you're now neglectful and easygoing, and always making one delay after another, and fixing first one day then another, after which you'll pay attention to yourself, what's going to happen? Now think about this. People do this sort of stuff. They create an intention. Oh, it's New Year's. I am going to finally get my life in order. I am going to start getting up every day and meditating and, doing some visualization exercises and reading my way through the Enchiridion or the discourses or Seneca's letters or whatever, and I'm going to really put it into practice. People make all sorts of plans like this. Oftentimes, I think that the plans substitute for the actual doing, because it's a lot easier to sit there and draw up all sorts of plans and schemas than to do the hard work of looking at yourself and saying, I don't like what I'm seeing. I need to fix this. This is disgusting, or this is revolting. Maybe my aversion needs to be turned towards the fact that I do this and I have these, reactions that I don't want to have, right? But people sit there and they make plans and they talk and talk and talk, and they don't actually do anything. It's not Stoicism too that's peculiar in this respect. You can think about St. Augustine in his Confessions. He talks about a period of years and years and years where he's basically ready to make the plunge into living a fully Christian life. And he says, this famous prayer, God, give me chastity. But not yet. Not yet, because I still want to enjoy myself a bit. There's time for that later. And then at a certain point you realize, this is nuts. I shouldn't be behaving this way. If I really think that this is the best way, I should be going full steam towards it. I should be, as people say, all in. So he says, what's going to be the cost if you are neglectful in this way? You make one delay after another, and you just make a bunch of plans and talk. Well, without realizing it, you will make no progress. But living and dying will continue to be a layman throughout, a person who is not on the philosophical path, a dilettante. You will not make any progress. As a matter of fact, the only progress you'll make is probably in being better at lying to yourself about the progress that you're making and putting out a better face of a dilettante to other people so they think that you're hot stuff and that you're actually into Stoicism. But if you're not doing it, there's no benefit to you. And the longer that you keep on delaying, he doesn't mention this here, but delay itself can turn into a habit, which then you have to break as well. That becomes even tougher. So he says, look, now's the time. Make up your mind before it is too late that the fitting thing for you to do, the right thing for you to do, the appropriate thing, is to live as a mature person who is making progress. Make a choice to actually grow up, as we say, and behave like a mature person. Take responsibility for your own feelings. Take responsibility for your choices, past and present. Take responsibility for your thoughts, for what it is that you filter situations through, for the stories that you've told yourself. Take responsibility for all of that. And then he says, let everything which seems to you to be best for you be a law which must not be transgressed. Here's that conception of law again. If you think that you should do some sort of action, like you decide that meditating every morning is what you need to do, then do it. Make it a law for yourself. Quit talking about it. Quit, making plans to do it. Quit reading benefits about it in articles and stuff like that. Do it. And if you stop doing it, then take yourself to task. Say, I broke the law. That doesn't mean you need to be punished or anything, but get yourself back on track. Quit making exceptions. So he goes on and he says, if you meet anything that is laborious or sweet or held in high repute or in no repute, remember now is the contest. If you meet the things that we encounter as challenges, laborious things that are going to require a lot of work on our part, that we tend to be averse to, and we put that off. Sweet temptations, right, that can draw us in, that can get us to do things that we shouldn't do, we have to stand up against that. Held in high repute, held in low repute, that shouldn't matter to us. Now is the time. That's why I said this is very, very timely advice, because anytime you read it, you can apply this. whether it's 2 millennia ago, whether it was yesterday when you first read it, or and then ignored it, whether it's today when you're watching this video and saying, oh, I should go back to that and reread that passage. It applies to us at every time. Now is the contest. So he goes on and he says, it's impossible to delay any longer. It depends on a single day and a single action whether progress is lost or saved. Again, this is why we want to make these precepts into laws for ourselves. Because as soon as we start to backslide, as soon as we start to give in, we start losing the progress that we've made. And we start to fall back into the natural tendencies, the old habits of thinking, which are actually tendencies against nature, against what human nature ought to be. But I say natural in a different sense here. These tendencies to justify ourselves, to tell us that it's okay for us on this one occasion, that we can fix it tomorrow, or that we weren't really doing it, we were just trying to do this instead. All these things are excuses that we give. If we want to really follow along the path of progress, we can't cut ourselves any slack in this respect. When we can cut ourselves slack is after we've screwed up, and then we don't have to tear ourselves down, but giving ourselves slack doesn't mean we don't get right back on the treadmill and start exercising again. We have to look at things honestly. We have to be true to ourselves and true to reason in our self-examination. So he goes on and he says, this is the way Socrates behaved. Socrates became what he was, and Socrates is a great hero to the Stoics, by paying attention to nothing but his reason, his rationality in everything that he encountered. Socrates got himself killed by practicing philosophy. And why did he practice philosophy? Because that seemed more rational to him to do than to do the opposite. And he tried to reason with the judges. He didn't convince them. His friend actually bought off the jailers and said, hey, we can transfer you to another city and you can do philosophy there and you don't have to die. What did he say to Crito? Let's think about this. Let's reflect on this. Let's reason about it. And his reasoning took him to the end of, no, it's better to obey the laws and to stay here and be executed. Socrates made such an impression on people because he did, in fact, use his rationality. He followed it. He didn't, make exceptions and say, well, my feelings are saying this, so I'm going to ignore what reason tells me. That would lead him to question his feelings, which we ought to do. Our emotions are not always not even often, the best judges or guides or interpreters of the situations that we're in. So he says, even if you're not yet a Socrates, still you ought to live as one who wishes to be a Socrates. If you want to be a Stoic, that's what it means to be a Stoic. To want to live like a Socrates, to want to live like a hero. To want to live as the Olympic victor of life. And the good news is, this is in all of our power. Our bodies, I'm not up to competing in the Olympics. I'm not even up to competing in, professional or even amateur sports of any sort, right? But we can do this with our choice, our faculty of choice, our rationality. Any one of us can live a fully human life. It's up to us to decide to do that. And the time to choose is when you become aware of that. Not down the line in some distant future. That may never happen because you could get hit by the bus tomorrow. You could get sick tomorrow. Do you want to reach the end of your life and say, oh yeah, I always had the intention of trying to live this way. Never really did it. Kind of sad about that. Or do you want to be able to look back over a time, back to the time where you finally said, yes, I need to make a decision and stick with it.